On this episode of Locked on Lightning, we continue our player reviews. Today, we're talking about Steven Stamkos.
You're Locked on Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of Locked on Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. On today's episode of Locked on Lightning, we're continuing our player reviews, looking back on the season, spotlighting every player on this team. Today, we're talking about Lightning captain Steven Stamkos, and we start off with the positives. And I always like these. I always like looking back on the season, and I know we did a segment around the All-Star break, talking really midway through the season how players were doing. We need to look back on those. I'm definitely going to look back on those and see what grades I gave these guys up until that point. And I think a lot of us, including myself at that point, we're kind of riding high on the Lightning just as a team, because I believe that was February. So I think that was around, if not right after the Lightning had the best month of the year. And really, I don't know. I feel like it's been a weird year for Steven Stamkos. I feel like he is somewhat maybe flown under the radar, or it's kind of not been, in my opinion, because I like to think of myself as a very level-headed Lightning fan, as we all know. And what I mean by that is that we go crazy every single time Stamkos do something, which is great. Obviously, I mean, he's the greatest player in franchise history, of course. But I feel like we don't talk about the negatives a lot with him. And obviously we will, as this episode goes along. But if you look at Stamkos and just putting his season in perspective, 81 games, 34 goals, 50 assists, that's 84 points on the season, plus minus of -5 for Stamkos. 14 of his goals this year were power play goals. Not a shock. 6 of his goals this year were game-winning goals. And not looking at his face-off percentage. I mean, if you really want to look at it, 53, pretty much a shade under 54 on the year, face-off percentage-wise. So pretty good season for him thus far. Obviously, the plus-minus kind of, you look at that as kind of like really the thing that really sticks out for him. We'll obviously talk about that on the later part of the episode. But looking at some of the positives he did this year, you look at the 34 goals, obviously, whenever Steven Stamkos is around the 30 to 40 goal mark, that's great. That's great news for the Lightning. I think that really the minimum we should look for him at, especially at this point in his career. Mind you, he's only 33, just turned 33 back in February. So in my opinion, still very much in the prime of his career. Maybe we'll get 2 more years out of him where we start to see maybe the numbers really start to dip. Then again, you never know. The science of training and nutrition has gone a long way since the early 2000s and 2010s. So, he could very well still be producing at this level very well late into his 30s. So, who knows? But what I really looked out of his numbers this year that really stuck out to me, and this was a big factor last year for Stamkos, and we spoke about this with Braden Point, and I feel like for the most part for this Lightning team as a whole, I think as we go on with the reviews, for a lot of players on this team, we'll look at how many games they played, because at this point in time, for the most part, except for maybe a couple of names here and there, we kind of all know what to expect out of players, and the biggest issue for this team as a whole over probably the last 3-4 seasons has really been the injury bug. And that is where the Lightning have kind of faltered, or kind of had to go out and get an extra piece, or kind of make do with what they got. You know, we're last couple of seasons we're talking about Stamkos being out 2020. Um, for the rest of the season, right when COVID hit. If you look back at that, remember when COVID hit? Probably what, second week of March. Stamkos goes out with an injury undisclosed. It turned out to be, I believe it was his lower body. It was a lower body injury, or actually no, it was upper body. Starts to make the comeback for the playoffs, lower body injury and conditioning, and then comes back for game 3 and scores that goal we all know and love, and which was just probably the most iconic goal I think of. I think we could agree probably the 2000s, or at least the 2010s. Um, and I would probably imagine probably the best goal in Stanley Cup final history. I think, maybe there's obviously some game winners here and there, but I think that's definitely up there. Um, and the reason why I bring that up is because we look at the progression of Stamkos from 2019 to 2020. Really, if you want to go back from 2016 to 2017, but really, you look at 2019, 2020, only 57 games, 2020, 2021, 38 games, 17 goals, 34 assists, 34 points, excuse me. 21-22 plays 81 games for the play, hits the 80 game mark basically for, just excuse my AC there. It's a billion degrees up here in New York already. Hits the 80 game mark for the first time since 2018-19, and it shows what really talent is there. The talent's always been there. And just to compare, in case you're not looking at a screen or looking at those stats right now, um, in 18-19, he had 82 games, 45 goals, 53 assists, 98 points, on the verge of hitting the 100-point mark. Last year, hits the 80 game mark, 42 goals, 106 points, hits the 100-point mark for the first time in his career. This year, a little bit of a setback year. I think really what it came down to, it was just, this was just a struggle season for most Lightning players, really, except when you look at it as a whole. Really, the only players that I felt like didn't really struggle that whole much this year was really Nikita Kucherov and Braden Point. Those two guys always felt, you always felt like could always find a way to score points, always be successful. And we saw that with Stamkos. He's obviously always going to take advantage of his his opportunities. And in the beginning of the season, if you remember correctly, at one point for a couple of months there, he was in the top 3 in goals. And so, the opportunities are there, and he was taking full advantage of them. And you could see even in his 32-year season, in his 31 going on 32-year-old season, the talent is there. And as we'll talk about with Stamkos, as we move on and review his season, really the issue with him lies is that he basically boxes himself in and almost turns himself into this one trick pony kind of player, which I think there's more to his game than that, than just shooting from the circle. I firmly believe, and we saw it later on in the season, and that's one of the positives you could also take, is that when he hits a wall, and he finally figured it out down the stretch in the regular season and then in the playoffs, he kind of figured it out where he was able to adjust finally. I don't know if maybe this was something that he was working on all season long, or maybe it was just something that really what it comes down to is that maybe he realized, I gotta figure something out because I'm not scoring. I've hit this wall where I'm basically barely putting up any points. The goals are not coming like they normally do. Something needs to be figured out. And I feel like with him, to a certain degree, like I said, he kind of cuts himself off. He doesn't allow himself to continue to score points and be successful. And but at the same time, you look at the shot he still has, one of the best in the league to do it from the faceoff circle. The only other player that really you could say was better than him from the faceoff circle and the one timer is Alexander Ovechkin, who 800 career goals. I mean, so of course. But I will say though, the one thing that I really liked about Stamkos this year, and not even the goal scoring and not even the consistency and staying healthy, was really his ability to find other players on his team, kind of take that secondary role at times, and not so much because as we saw in years past, kind of the offense kind of flowed through him in a certain degree. You know, obviously when you look at the Lightning offense, you see or really you mostly think about Nikita Kucherov quarterbacking that offense, cycling the puck around when the Lightning are not on the rush. But you kind of always figured it's kind of like when you look at basketball, the Lakers usually when they need a big time shot, who do they defer to? It's always LeBron James. And I felt like in the last couple of years, especially early on this year, the Lightning have always deferred to Steven Stamkos, which is fine. But as the season went on, like we know, the roles changed. Braden Point became the guy. At certain times, it was Brandon Hagel became the guy. Nick Paul at certain times, Alex Killorn at certain times, even Nikita Kucherov at times became the guy for a bulk of the season. But down the stretch, like I said, I think his ability to evolve really helped the Lightning down the stretch and really, to a certain degree, helped them in the series, even though they weren't successful in moving on. I thought really we saw the start of something that could potentially open up even more Steven Stamkos' game down low in the dirty areas, which really excited to see how that turns out going into next season. So keep an eye on that. So I think if I'm looking at Steven Stamkos' season as a whole, and I'm looking at the stats, but not completely taking them in as the whole thing, 84 points after a 106-point season. I'm looking at Steven Stamkos, and I'm giving him a B plus. You know, I think that like I said, we started to see the start of something really good in his game at the end of the season, but I want to see a full season of that. I didn't, like I said, we don't really sometimes see a lot of creativity to his game, and if we could see a little bit more of that, that'd be phenomenal. And I think that we would see another bump in his points and his goal production going forward. So we'll talk about more, you know, what he needs to improve in his game. You kind of already know where I'm going with this. So stick around. But first, we need to talk about our friends at Indeed. Now, Indeed is the hiring platform where you could attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Instead of spending hours on multiple job sites searching for the candidates with the right skills, Indeed's powerful hiring platform that can help you do it all with streamlined hiring with powerful tools that find you matched candidates. Indeed is unbelievably powerful hiring platform, delivering 4 times more hires than any other job sites combined, according to Talent Nest 2019. Join more than 3 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. So start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your post on Indeed.com/locked on. Offer good for a limited time. Indeed.com/locked on. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. So once again, I'm going to thank everybody for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead, subscribe to our channel on YouTube. We are available wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We are also available. You could hit up the show on Twitter, LO_Lightning on Twitter. Follow us on Instagram, locked_Lightning on Instagram. Go ahead and do that. Hit me up, Danky Dank, DENKYD8NK. Love hearing from all of you. And a little special announcement. So we started a partnership with SiriusXM. So SiriusXM partnership includes promoting to the radio broadcast of the team. So go ahead and follow the Lightning going forward next season. You'll be able to hear the Lightning on SiriusXM, obviously, and listen, you know, to me as well. So go ahead and do that as well. So really looking back at Steven Stamkos, really, it's one of those things where I've kind of been picking at it all season long, and that's why I feel. And I'm not saying, and when we did our recap of Leaf series, I'm not saying, I kind of made it feel like Vasilevsky and the defense was the reasoning as to why this season went the way it did, and that's 100% true. At the same time, I feel like if there was just a little bit more dynamic to the Lightning in general in their offensive game, I'm not saying it would have been a whole ton of difference. I don't think it would have really made a big difference. Um, because really at the end of the day, um, the Leafs were just the better team. I'm not saying they wanted it more, but down the stretch, they really took it to the Lightning. Um, and in a situation like that, I would have liked to have seen Stamkos really go off, really take the game into his hands, and really go ahead and really put the team on his back. We've seen him do it before, and I know he's in his early 30s. He's 2 years away from hitting the 35-year mark, but at the same time, in a series like this where you have 2 goals and 4 points after scoring 30 plus goals and on the 80-point mark, where really I felt like, to a certain degree and to a certain fault, even though it was very encouraging that his play was kind of branching out into other parts of the ice, which is great. We didn't really see a whole lot of play from the circle. I might be mistaken from that, but kind of thinking about the series now, I don't remember really any moments to where the the Lightning were kind of going to him in certain situations. And that could be a game plan thing. I kind of figured that, he was just they kind of figured that the Leafs were ready for that, and that's fine. But and maybe that's a whole conversation we could have later on in the summer. Who is really to blame, and what could have been done better in this series. I mean, but really, what I'm getting to is that I feel like when Stamkos focuses on a part of his game or a certain aspect of his game, in this point, working down low, which is phenomenal, which is absolutely phenomenal. I love to see a guy who kind of gets out of his comfort zone as the season's going on, and kind of trying to figure it out as season's going on. And even in the playoffs, that's great. But I kind of feel like oftentimes with Stammer, the issue with him is that it's kind of just that, and there's nothing else that works for me, which, as we all know, isn't true. He has one of the best slap shots, one of the best one timers from the circle. Um, and as we've seen, he also can dangle it a little bit down low. And I feel like there needs to be a certain situation for him, at least, where he kind of, as captain and as the leader, I feel like it's his place to where he could kind of go to John Cooper, and say, let's do this that way. And I'm not saying in the course of a game, maybe between periods, or even in practice, especially if you kind of realize, or you kind of see that the Leafs or any other team, it doesn't even have to be in the playoffs, any team is susceptible to that. And we saw, especially down the stretch in the regular season, even though the Lightning weren't winning games, the one thing that they were doing well was they were getting dirty area, high scoring, high danger opportunities. And a lot of that had to do with Stamkos. And I just think that we need to see a lot more of that from him. I think, he's still at a point of his career where he could very well still assert himself, and put the Lightning on his back. And I feel like it's more so him just not at times wanting to play selfish hockey, which I feel like to a certain degree a player like him can. I feel like a player like Kucherov can, and we'll talk about that when we talk about Kucherov. But I really think that there are moments where, during the regular season especially, where Steven Stamkos, this team almost needed him to go out there and say, I got this. Just feed me and we'll we'll take it from there. I didn't really see that from him. There was games this year where there were shifts where you didn't even realize he was on the ice. There was games where he really didn't he kind of was just offensive oriented. And if you want to say I'm wrong, look at his plus minus this year. You can't be on the top line with a team that scores as much as the Lightning and have a minus in the plus minus department. That's just I'm sorry, that's unacceptable. That's just how I'm going to look at it, especially when you play it on line with Braden Point and Nikita Kucherov, and you get tons of power play time, and the Lightning are one of the top teams in the league in giving up shorthanded goals on the power play. They need to do a better job of that, and that all starts from your leaders. That all starts from your captain, especially. And when he's in the negative, and you're making it to the playoffs, and you're one of the best teams in terms of points and in the Eastern Conference, at least, that's an issue. And I would really like to see him, he does lay the occasional hit. I'm not saying he has to go out there and be a sandpaper guy. And we know that he's not afraid of being physical. We saw him go after Matthews in this series, which is great, which is phenomenal. I would kind of like to see that here and there throughout the course of the season. I'm not saying that he has to fight all the time, but I would like to see him become more of a complete around player, whether it's laying big hits, whether it's being more assertive on defense, or really kind of in the middle of a shift, especially on the power play, kind of saying to his players, let's slow it down. Let's set up instead of just trying to go spit shot fire on rush chances on and on and on. And you might be saying, well, you know what, they have a game plan. Well, you know what, he has that responsibility and has that position on the team. And I firmly believe on the bench, when he could kind of turn around to Coop and say, hey, listen, this ain't working. We need to try something different. So I'm not saying, kind of having said that, I'm not saying that he's not a good leader. That's absolutely not what I'm trying to say. I just feel like he needs to be more assertive all around. I feel like, especially in the defensive department, he really needs to kind of really clamp down. And I'm not saying he needs to go out there and win the Selkie or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. He just needs to be a leader in every single aspect of the game of hockey over the course of a game. And I feel like when he does that, and especially when it reflects in and I know that doesn't paint a whole picture, the plus minus, but I think that if he gets that, if that number gets better next year, I think the rest of the team will follow suit, and we'll start to see better results down the stretch. And we'll continue to talk about some of the issues that the Lightning face this season. But yeah, it really all starts from the top. And when I say the top, I mean your captain. So wrapping things up, let me know in the comments below what you think about my review with Steven Stamkos. How did you feel about his season? Like I said, I'm not blaming him for all the issues, but hockey is a very team-oriented sport. I firmly believe that when a team plays bad or doesn't play up to the expectations that you wish they were playing up to, you always have to kind of look at a couple of things: the goaltending, the coaching, and the captain, especially if he's a vital part of the production of that team, which Steven Stamkos is. And I'm not going to completely blame him for all the problems the Lightning had this year, because let's face it, first part of the season, he was a bona fide first line forward. And that showed. Like I said earlier in the episode, he led the league in goals for, I would say, probably a couple of months. And then you started to see it kind of him fall off a little bit there. And really in that point, that falls on John Cooper to say, especially down the stretch, when most times, and like I said, most shifts and most games, he really didn't do much of anything. I always look at players that are struggling, that are scorers. When you're going through your hiccups, case in point, last year, Brandon Hagel, When he came to the Lightning, he wasn't doing a lot offensively, which was why he was brought in. What are you doing for me other than doing what you were brought into? And he was playing physical. And, I don't have his plus minus in front of me right now, but I would imagine it was somewhat decent. Now, like I said, plus minus is depending on what school of thought you're in. Me, I don't think it paints the whole picture for forwards. Defensemen are a little bit of a different story. But with Stamkos, I feel like if you're putting up 84 points on the first line and your goal totals in the low to mid 30s, his was 34. I kind of look at his assist numbers. I kind of look at his plus minus and think, what else are you doing other than scoring goals? And I also feel like Cooper needed to kind of step in that moment and kind of. I think a lot of us were also shouting for him to get moved down, which wouldn't have been a bad idea. But I feel like to a certain degree, Cooper didn't want to move his captain and a guy who just came off a 100-point season down because he was struggling. I think he always kind of hoped to some degree that he was going to be able to turn it back on. And we didn't really see that until later on in the season when he was kind of changing things up. And I think really next season, I really hope, I'm not saying let's move Stamkos down the lines just yet, but I think that he needs to be placed somewhere on the ice other than the circle. I feel like everybody in the building knows it. He has a great shot, but at the same time, you're going to have one or two opposing players in that lane ready to try and block that shot with the goaltender ready to block that in the upper 90. And either Stamkos needs to know whether or not to not take that shot and maybe skate in and, go for a rebound, shoot for a rebound, or maybe try and dish it off to someone else because there's people open. There's always people open. So, this offseason and, all the things that we will be hearing about and all the things that we'll be seeing in the early stages of next season will truly be telling in terms of how the Lightning play if they've learned from their past mistakes. And that I fully believe that Steven Stamkos is hopefully going to learn from his past mistakes and start to learn some new tricks and rely on those tricks in order for the Lightning to get back to the Stanley Cup final and raise another Stanley Cup. So we'll be back on the next episode. We're going to be talking more player reviews. We're also going to be talking some player transactions. A lot of talk coming this offseason. Can the Lightning, what can they do really with this roster? A lot of decisions are going to need to be made about re-signing players, about trading possibly players. The name that we'll be talking a lot about in the coming weeks. It was originally going to be Alex Killorn, but I kind of shifted gears, especially after the NHL lottery draft last night. I'm now looking at Ross Colton. I think he is going to be the hottest commodity on this team going forward because he is a restricted free agent. His contract's up. There's a lot of teams that are out there that are going to be in need of a third line forward. Ross didn't really have a really good year this year. Struggled quite a bit in the scoring department. Played physical, which we'll talk quite a bit about Ross when we get to his player review probably next week. But I think there's going to be a lot of teams that are going to be looking at the Tampa Bay Lightning with somewhat of their abundance of riches, their embarrassment of riches, really, at the forward position. Because as we all know, scoring isn't the issue for this Lightning team. It's defense. And unfortunately, you're going to probably have to give up some scoring in order to get back some defense or even with the Lightning, if they can't get any defense in a trade, they're going to go after it in free agency, but they're going to have to clear up some cap space. And unfortunately, most likely, if they do make a move to clear up cap space via trade, it's probably going to be Ross Colton, whose number is going to be up. So we'll keep an eye on that. We'll keep an eye on, and we'll discuss as it goes along Who are the other teams, the prospect teams that we could possibly see be willing to make a deal with Tampa Bay Lightning in order for the Lightning to maybe get a draft pick in the first 2 rounds of this year's draft? So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about player reviews. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast. Once again, give us follows wherever podcasts are distributed. Subscribe to the YouTube channel and comment below this video. Let me know what you think. Ask questions from mailbag. I will answer all the questions when I get to them. I can't promise I'll answer them on the next episode, but I have been seeing some here and there that we will definitely get to as we go along. So in the meantime, that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I'll talk to you.